Wow.
Okay. Hello, everyone. We are a few minutes late, but I was speaking with Professor Matania regarding the attendance to class, and there are some requests I received in the recent days. So Aviatar and Abigail will send an email clarifying what are the obligations regarding attendance. There are a few very particular reasons to be accepted for attending class. So those who are not part of these groups should be attending classes, and they will notify and send an email clarifying these issues. I hope soon. Anyhow, today we are talking about sovereignty, but before that, we'll complete the discussion from last week about the connections between technology and IR paradigms. And then we'll discuss sovereignty. We'll discuss what sovereignty is based on the 4 classifications or categories of sovereignty that Krasner presented in his paper. And based on that, we'll discuss and we'll open it for discussion, your discussion, like last week in groups, about what might be the challenges that cyber technology pose to sovereignty in each of these types of sovereignties. So whether and how, and whether states can address these challenges. This is the other part of the discussion. And then we'll start. I'm not sure we'll complete this today because we're also starting from the leftovers from last week. But we'll try to summarize the ways in which cyber technologies enhance states' sovereignty, because we can see of the ways in which states can be more powerful, do better control over the territories, and so on. But on the other hand, what are the challenges that cyber technologies pose to state sovereignty? So we spoke last week about neorealism and technology. We just to remind the discussion we have, we talked about neorealism as a structural approach that assumes that there is what? Anarchy. War system is characterized by anarchy, and the implications of the anarchy on actors' behavior is that they are striving to survive by self-help practices. They know that there is no supreme authority above the states. So they need to protect themselves, otherwise they will not be able to survive. And this causes a number of dynamics in world politics. We'll talk about it next week, and we'll talk about it also when we talk about the security dilemma. The main implications for cyber or technologies in general is that neorealists see technologies as a resource of the state. So it's not necessarily change international politics, but also there is a main obstacle for neorealist theories, because neorealism assumes that states, and especially great powers, are the most important actors in world politics, and therefore these approaches do not provide useful lenses through which we can observe the non-state actors, which we know in the cyber domain are very important. So I'm mentioning it because neoliberalism, to some extent, overlaps with some of the assumption of neorealism. Foremost, they also assumes that world politics is characterized by anarchy. So there's no difference between neorealism and neoliberalism regarding the core characteristics of world politics. They both assume that anarchy, the absence of a supreme authority above the state, is a main characteristic of world politics. Nonetheless, the difference, or a main difference, is the chances of cooperation. Neo-realists are very pessimistic about the chances of cooperation because they see state power all the way down as a key element of world politics. Neoliberals suggest that the negative impact of the anarchy can be mitigated, for example, by international institutions. And the international institutions, like organizations, like international regimes, can provide actors with tools to better handle the anarchy. It doesn't eliminate the anarchy of world politics. The fact that we have international organizations according to the neoliberal doesn't mean what the system is not anarchical. However, the negative implications of the anarchy, that states need to gain more and more power to survive by practices of self-help, is to some extent limited, according to the neoliberal scholars. And of course, we'll talk about it when we'll discuss international regimes and international institutions in one of the next classes. So we get more deeply into the dynamics and the mechanisms of this approach. I will not discuss it now, but basically, or in short, we can have rules, we can have regulation, we can have repeated games, we can have information. The institution can provide actors with information that is them the ability to cooperate and to prevent the negative consequences of the anarchy. So this is a key element of neoliberal. It is inspired by, on the one hand, liberal scholars, and on the other hand, by game theory. Game theory was an important inspiration for these approaches because they show how actors in a competition can cooperate, or when they can cooperate, or what are the conditions under which cooperation is more likely. For example, think of the prisoner's dilemma, okay, or chicken game, or the this kind of or the stag hunt. You know the stag hunt game? Stag hunt, that they hunting for a stag. They can get much more food if they capture the stag, but there is uncertainty whether everyone will join the hunting. So this we'll talk about it more when we talk about the theories, but they show how cooperation how actors can cooperate in different kinds of games, and this was an important inspiration for the neoliberal approaches in IR. In addition, and this is almost by definition or grows directly from what I said earlier, is that they acknowledge, neoliberal scholars acknowledge, that not only states are important actors in world politics. So we also have the different kinds of non-state actors, including organizations and institutions like the UN and the WTO and so on, but also they also acknowledge other non-state actors such as corporations and private sectors, and of course different other kinds of actors, including interest group and other sources of influence in domestic politics. So for neorealists, as I think I mentioned it last week, but it would be useful to emphasize it also now. For neorealists, the state, domestic politics, is part of the black box. They call it black box. They don't enter it. They don't look into what is going on in domestic politics because the interests of the state are determined by the system. The anarchy is what constitutes and shape the actors' behavior. It doesn't matter who are politicians or what is the ideology or what type of regime, the regime of the state. We'll get into that when we talk about neorealism next week. But this is a key difference between neorealism and neoliberalism. Neoliberalism does acknowledge these kind of actors, and they also emphasize the importance of different kind of dynamics, including economy. For neorealist scholars, economy is important because economy or money can be is a source of hard power. If you have money, you can purchase tanks, you can purchase other weapons, and so on. So it's a very important aspect of world power, of states' power. For neoliberal, economy is important not only because of the military implications of the economy, but they have different kinds of other implications, including the importance of globalization and connectedness of all politics and so on. So, what is the implication of this understanding for cyber and for technology in general? What would you say about? I mean, it's obviously what Ericsson and Guacamela also suggested. That we don't need to invent new ideas, but what would be the implications of this approach for technology or for cyber technologies?
Maybe the fact that, like, as you said earlier, that they acknowledge the presence of non-state actors in politics, and they acknowledge also the presence and importance that cyber technology can exert on the political system and also the power of the state.
Exactly. So we have this opens a wide area for research in different ways. For example, acknowledging the non-state actors. We cannot address them through neorealism because they overlook these kind of actors. We can start thinking of these actors. We can think of institutions, and we can think of different kind of other practices like globalization, transnationalism, and so on. But also the fact that acknowledging the various actors involved in world politics allows, for example, to acknowledge domestic politics and how they use or take advantage of cyber technologies. We'll talk about it later when we talk about sovereignty and the challenges to sovereignty. We can think of international corporations, and of course the tech giants and so on through these approaches. And we can also think about international regimes and international institutions. So, for example, an important question, and we'll try to answer it in the class we'll have about international regimes, is why it is so difficult to establish strong regimes regulating the cyber domain. We don't have a very strong regulation on cyber technology as we have on different kind of world challenges, like, for example, the NPT would be the Non-Proliferation Treaty is a good example of a very strong treaty that has been established like decades ago in the 60s, and regulating the ability to acquire nuclear technologies. We don't have a similar practices in the cyber domain, and part of the challenges can be explained through the neoliberal approaches, which explain the conditions under which international regimes can be established. So, despite the fact that we don't have these regimes, we can try to explain why it is so difficult to establish these kinds of regimes. And part of the answer is that we have various kinds of actors, as we mentioned earlier. We need to regulate not only state actors but also non-state actors, and the states and the non-state actors. I mean, each of them have different kinds of interests. Different states have different interests, and of course, the non-state actors have different interests, and you need to regulate the behavior of all of them in order to make an effective regime. Part of the challenges with the neoliberal approach is the question of security and the ability of this approach to provide a useful lenses to understand international security in the cyber domain. And it is part of the criticism about this approach, although I can think that we can draw some important notions from this approach. For example, the challenges of establishing international regimes can be an important contribution of this approach to understand international security in the cyber domain. Any question about neoliberalism? I mean, we'll delve deeply into this approach when we dedicate the class. So just the structure of the approaches and the course before we continue with more specific issues. And lastly is constructivism, which is a completely different approach than the neorealism and the neoliberalism, because it starts, or the point of departure of this approach is completely different from the other two approaches. The neoliberalism and neorealism are positivist approaches, which assumes there is causal connections between variables. So X causing Y. For example, if we think of the democratic peace theory, we have a causal connection between the type of regime and the chances of violence between these states. This is a causal explanation. Or if we talk about neorealism and some of the neorealist approaches, they draw causal connection between the balance of power and stability. We mentioned it last week about whether unipolar, bipolar, or multipolar system are more stable. This is the causal connection. The causality is not always clear and not always correct, but the argument is providing a causal connection between variables. This is not the case with constructivism. Constructivism does not provide causal connection between variables, but rather to try to provide understanding, not explanation, but understanding of the international politics. And therefore, constructivist scholars study social constructions, identity, norms, discourse, and things like that, which provide an understanding of the situation rather than explanation. They do not provide a causal explanation as the other approaches. I can provide some examples. I don't want to discuss it too much, but there can be some examples. For example, Wendt, which is one of the leading constructivist scholars in international relations, suggested that anarchy, which is the assumption of world politics according to neorealists, is a social construction. So if policymakers think that world is characterized by anarchy, they are acting as if these assumptions are true, and therefore they are becoming a self-fulfilling prophecy. If we assume that the world is anarchy and we act as if this is the case, we make the world an anarchical entity. Of course, we'll also discuss these approaches more deeply, but of course, if we're talking about the implications of this approach to the study of cyber and the study of technology, we can rely heavily on what we mentioned in the beginning of last week when we distinguished between the social constructivist approach to technology and the technological determinism. So, of course, the constructive approach is on the side of that opposed to technological determinism. It assumes that societies, according to the norms, interests, identities, decide which kind of technologies to develop, whether to invest in technologies and to what extent, and they also determine the way of how to use this technology. I mentioned it last week when we talked about this. If you remember about nuclear deterrence and deterrence in general, that we can think of the nuclear technology as through the technological determinism approach, and then we can think of scholars like Kenneth Waltz, who says that this the more is better. The technology enforced actors to become rational entities, but this is not necessarily the case, as the social constructivist approach would suggest, and it shows how the decision to develop nuclear weapon, how the decisions to use them are not an outcome of deterministic forces that shape the actor's behavior, but rather on specific people who were in a juncture of decision and decided what to do with these technologies, and it could easily be different. And actually, there are many experts and scholars who suggested to use nuclear weapons in a different way rather than to use them for deterrence. So it's social, and it's affected by norms, identities, social constructions, and so on. We'll of course talk more about these approaches when we talk about the constructivist approaches during the course. So, for example, if we talk about social constructions and cyber, we can ask different kinds of questions. For example, we mentioned briefly mentioned it last week, but and we'll also further discuss in one of the next classes. But what is violence? What is violence when we talk about cyber technology? Whether the use of cyber technologies is an act of violence. For example, whether the Israel alleged attack on Iran nuclear facilities with Stuxnet is an act of violence.
Depends on the outcome, though.
This is a question. This can be a question, but it's not the question we ask with kinetic attacks. What constitutes an act of violence is not necessarily the damage, but rather the act itself. If you target a base with missiles, it's an act of violence. Not the most severe act of violence, maybe, but it's an act of violence. But the fact you attacked, consider the following scenario: you attacked, you initiated cyber attack, like the Stuxnet. Nobody hurts. Just you create some damage to infrastructures. This is an act of violence or not? I mean, it's and the question whether it is a violence or not, or whether it constitutes an act of war, is socially determined. It's not necessarily the objective criteria that need to answer this or provide the direction to answer these kinds of questions. There is a very famous book of Thomas Reed. Anybody heard of Thomas Reed? Thomas Reed, who suggested, or the title of the paper and then of the book was "There will be no cyber war," and the reason is that, according to Thomas Reed, if we are taking the definitions of Clausewitz for war, there will be no cyber war, because cyber war cannot adhere to the criteria of Clausewitz for war, basically. But if we look from the perspective of social constructivism on this, the question what is war is socially determined. And therefore, the criteria of Clausewitz may be irrelevant to what will be decided in the future about what war is. So, I mean, this is the example of how we can use constructivism and social construction to understand and study cybersecurity.
I have a question.
Yes, sure.
Earlier you said that, like, when it comes to constructivism, they're aimed at states to provide understanding, not an explanation of international politics. So could we say that constructivism looks at the implications rather than the causes?
Not necessarily. As the example I showed now with the question of what violence is, it's first, it's a way to challenge the assumption of world politics or to look at different directions. So what they would emphasize is the social context. What are the norms, the identities of the actors, how they see the world, rather than what objectively the world is.
So they look at towards like a more like subjective.
Intersubjective, they would say.
Okay.
Intersubjective in the sense that it's not for example, psychological approaches would look at the subjective level. So what is the way a policymaker, how a certain policymaker is interpreting the situation? There are many works, especially since the 70s, on that, like Jervis, Jenny Stein, Nedley Bohr, many others that develop psychological approaches to international relations. So they focus on the human level. On the constructivist approach is not on the individual, but the society, how the society see these things. And the society can be defined in different ways. The society can be a state. I mean, the people, the individual of a state, but it can be the international community, okay, or the Europeans, for example, or the North Americans, or whatever we want to study. So it's not the subjective, but the intersubjective level. But I didn't want to bring too much concepts for this class. But this is exactly the point. This is exactly the difference between the individual and the individual level of psychological approaches and the way that constructivism studies it.
I have a question. I want to go back. You mentioned that any act of cyber is a threat. And you gave the example with the factory. But let's say if this factory is threatening to attack, nuclear.
Yeah, of course. But
if you're doing this act in order to stop them, to stop the act of the violence, is it still called violence because you're stopping the violence?
Yes, but the question is not whether it is justified or not. What the argument you're bringing is to answer the question whether it is legitimate to retaliate or to preempt or to initiate an attack. This is a legitimate question, important question, and we can draw implication for international law, maybe also from constructivism, whether it is justified or not. But the question is whether under international law there are situations in which you are allowed to use force.
So it's not called violence.
And it would be violence, but it's a legitimate violence. So the question, but whether it is violence or not is socially determined. And also the question whether it is legitimate to use the force or not. So I'm not implying that it's not necessarily justified. It's the question of using violence depends on our definition of what violence is, or the question of whether it's an act of war depends on what we define as a war. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's unjustified. There is a long kind of detailed discussion in international relations on what is called the just war theory of scholars who developed the conditions under which it's legitimate to use force, and this is a very established doctrine. I mean, different scholars, different experts would debate what are the conditions, what are the exact conditions, but there are conditions that can justify an act of war, or justify the act of violence. This, of course.
But it will be called violence either way. This is what
I mean,
I'm
it
trying
can
to
be violence. It could be. You can retaliate without doing violence. I mean, you can name and shame the opponent, but I mean, this is not a likely scenario, but potentially I can think of how this could be an act of violence in the future. That in a specific social context, like in 50 years from now, naming and shaming will be illegitimate, and it will be an act of violence. I mean, this is maybe crazy, but this is how we can think of social development. We cannot know. Most likely, it will not be an act of violence, but the question whether something is an act of violence or not is socially determined. It's not necessarily determined by the objective elements of this act, of the act.
A quick question here.
Sure.
Does the constructionism also include the culture
Yes.
and political culture, culturally formed norms? Because here you said ideas, knowledge, but does it include all the tradition and
Yes. For example, if you look into the identity of actors, culture is one of the most important characteristics that shape the actors' identities. For example, the Jewish identity or identities. Of course, they are affected heavily by the Jewish collective memory, for example, or collective memories along the years. So, of course, the culture is one. Actually, the first studies on constructivism in international relations start from study of culture, which were established in other fields before it came to international relations, because basically the constructivist approach basically based on sociology. It's kind of a sociological approach to international relations.
and this approach, does it look on societies like something as something stable or something fluid that can change over time?
We have different kinds of approaches within constructivism. For example, the question what identity is. So some scholars suggest that we cannot study identity because identity is something that all the time changes. So there's no, it's like problems in measuring in physics, that you cannot determine the identity because it all the time changes. And now there's no more the identity that was in T-1. So you cannot, but most of the scholars suggest that you can, you can still study identities, and they acknowledge that it changes, but you can show also the change and what it means. So, for example, the democratic identity of states. Okay, we can argue, or some scholars argue that democratic state or some of the democratic states has a democratic identity. What this means differs not only among states, but also over time within a state. What was a democracy 50 years ago and what democracy is now is not exactly the same. But they saw themselves 50 years from now, 50 years ago, and now they see themselves as democracy, but the content of this identity has changed. I will provide much more information about these approaches when we discuss them, and we have more than one class on different kind of constructivist approaches. Okay, so I don't have time for this, but if you want at home, I will have you will have the slide, so you can enter this. This is a very short interview with Yuval Noah Harari about the AI. And the question, it alludes to the question of social determinism and technological determinism and social constructivism, whether AI and how we interpret the challenge of this technology. If you want, you can look into that. So, if there's no more questions, I will move to sovereignty. So, what sovereignty is? Yes.
I wrote something down off the book I read. It says sovereignty, right, of powers in the Orwellian sense, so it involves, among other things, the right to specify and govern all property arrangements within a given territory, not to be confused with property rights.
Yes. Good. So, a key element of sovereignty is territory, right? And this also a hint regarding the challenges that we have, because cyber is not exactly a territory. I mean, we can discuss this also when we mentioned it, but it may have some implications or issues to do with this assumption. So let's go and I mean, there are different kinds of definitions to sovereignty. They all, of course, refer to the question of territory, and they refer to questions of control and authority. I mean, in different ways, domestically, internationally. So all the questions about sovereignty refers in one way or another to questions of control and authority in a given territory. So one kind of category or aspect of sovereignty is what Krasner refers to as interdependent sovereignty. And this category has to do with the ability of states to control movement across their borders. So obviously it's about the control, not the authority. The question is not whether states are a legitimate entity to control this territory, but whether they have the control, the physical control. And we can think of different challenges, not only the cyber, but globalization, for example, challenges of immigration, put the state in the position that it cannot fully control the territory, or not all states can fully control all of the territory. And this is one key element of sovereignty. The second is domestic sovereignty. And it refers to authority. Authority structures within states and the ability of these structures to effectively regulate behavior. And here, this is a classic element of not international relations, but political science. The connections between legitimacy and effectiveness. Because there are scholars who suggest that they are interdependent, these two elements. So a state with legitimacy is more effective, but also the opposite, that a more effective state has more legitimacy.
And also the execution of power, like the right to execute violence, for instance, it's here.
It's part of this. I mean, domestically. Yeah, domestically. It's also overlap with some other kind of sovereignties, but we can think of it also here. And the challenge of, I mean, I'll get back to it later on, but failed states have neither legitimacy nor the ability to control the territory. But as we'll discuss it later on, they do have something that is important. What they have?
Sorry.
Failed states.
They have the state, the territory.
They have the territory, and what else they have?
People.
They have
They have structures.
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 In terms of sovereignty, what kind of sovereignty they do have?
Brute force. Domestic.
They don't have domestic because they cannot regulate and they don't have authority.
Acknowledge.
They regulate.
Exactly, they are acknowledged as a state. This is why they are. This is why it's a state. They have international acknowledgement of being a state, despite the fact that they are not functioning as a state. So they, for example, may have a state in the UN, as many other states, and they have an acknowledgement for the territory. The international authority is acknowledged by other states who do not intervene in the territory, but they are not functioning as a state. I mean, this is it's called failed state, semi-state, quasi-state. There are different kind of concept to refer to this kind of situation, but this is this alludes to the same thing. On the opposite, we have a very effective or powerful state that can have both legitimacy and effectiveness. So, and as I mentioned earlier, it relates to each other. So, a more effective state gains legitimacy, but the legitimacy enhances its effectiveness. You want to cooperate with a state that is effective. I mean,
they have interdependence or independence?
Sorry?
Failed states that have interdependence or they heavily control their borders, no in, no out.
It depends. I mean, it depends. There are differences among. It's not necessarily the definition of failed state. Failed state is a state that cannot control the inside. It might put all the efforts outside. I mean, it depends on the specific situation, but and in some of the situations they don't need to invest much. They are not challenged internationally. There's no there is no external forces that threaten to conquer the territory, so they don't need to invest. Of course, as some scholars would suggest, this invites international intervention for different reasons. Because, for example, failed states may send immigrants to other states that would destabilize the politics of other states. So they want to intervene in order to make this territory more stable and prevent immigration that would destabilize their territories. For example, think of the Indian intervention in East Pakistan is called
Kashmir?
no, not Kashmir. No, it's a small, very poor state.
Bangladesh.
Bangladesh, right. Bangladesh is a state that has, I mean, part of the struggle between East and West Pakistan. There are all waves of refugees from Bangladesh to India. So India intervened in this war in order to prevent the waves of refugees into its territory. So failed states invite international intervention, especially it involves in this kind of situation. But it's not necessary. It's not part of the definition of failed state.
I think there is a question on Zoom.
Yeah, but I cannot address the Zoom. The spell of sovereignty. Refers to the exclusion of external sources of authority.
This is the third one.
This is the third one, yes.
But this was like the original
Yes.
notion of with the theory with the Pact of Westphalia, no?
Yes, yes. So this is Westphalia. The idea that states are not intervening in the domestic affairs of other states. And part of it's the acknowledgement of the monopoly of the use of force. So each state become a monopoly. So Krasner, I don't remember if it was in this paper or in another paper, call it the cartel of states. Because if each state has the monopoly in its territory, so together the states has a cartel on the use of force. I mean, they grant each other the monopoly on the specific territories of each state. So together they are forming a cartel of who is entitled to use violence.
Is it like United States of America?
All the states, all the states, they have the monopoly. Each state has not only the monopoly of the use of force, but the legitimate monopoly of the use of force in the domestic politics.
Can you explain again?
I'll get to the next one, and then if it still be unclear, I'll answer. So here we talk about the international level. So internationally, it is not legitimate to intervene in other states, not practically and not by law. And there is a recognition. This is the recognition of each state territory, and states should avoid intervening in other states' territories. And they should respect the monopoly of each state on the use of force and over the general. I mean, this is not only about the use of force, but in general, each state has the monopoly to decide what is going on its territory. For example, the idea of international intervention, according to the UN Charter, is you cannot intervene. You need to be asked by a state to intervene in your territories. This is different from the new doctrine of international intervention, the R2P. What is R2P?
Responsibility.
Yeah, right. Responsibility to protect, which is the different doctrine of intervention, because the assumption is that sometimes the state itself is a source of insecurity to human security or for humans. So we cannot ask the states to whether we should intervene or not. We need to intervene to prevent situations in which humans are threatened. But the original UN in the UN Charter, it is the state. Because of the idea of sovereignty, you cannot intervene in the state. You need the state to ask to intervene. And lastly, we have the international legal sovereignty, which refers to mutual recognition of a country in there being an independent political entity. So if we conclude this kind of types of sovereignty, it's about control over territory. So a sovereign state has a control over the territory. So it's control the movement of goods, of people within the territory. It exerts its power. The state employs its law over the territory. It's the authority of the state. There's no intervention in the state by other actors, and states recognize each other territories. So as I mentioned earlier, failed states has the external recognition, but they do not control. In fact, they do not control the territories, their territories. Another definition of sovereignty is the famous definition of Weber, which is the legitimate use of violence within a given territory. This alludes to your question, because this is a classical definition of sovereignty, which goes back to the idea of the use of force. So the question is who is not only who can use force, because of course there are different kinds of actors who want to use force, and also the mafia is using force, right? And sometimes effectively. But according to this definition, they would not be seen as a sovereign entity, because the question is not about the use of force, about the legitimate use of force. So the state has the legitimacy domestically and internationally to use force within its territories. This is the idea of Weber about what sovereignty is. So there are different challenges to that, and we of course discuss it later on. We'll discuss cyber because cyber could put question to it. But basically, this is the idea of sovereignty. I mean, this is another way to think of sovereignty, and there are different challenges. If you remember when there was the debate about the privatization of prisons, this is exactly the question of the use of force, because you grant non-state actors the ability to use force, which was a privilege of state entities before. You grant this privilege to a non-state actor, to a private actor that its interests are economics. And I mean, this is different, but the answer, or part of the answer, was that, well, the sovereign state can decide to whom to grant its the ability to use force. I mean, and there are some debates on this issue, but basically, this is another way, or key way, or very short way to summarize what sovereignty is. I mean, the idea of Weber is a classical definition. So let's move to a discussion. So what I would like you to do is to form like small groups like last week, and then to discuss these two questions. One is whether or what types of sovereignty cyber technology might challenge, and of course how. And there might be challenges to each of these four categories that we mentioned in the previous slide. And the second question is concerns Krasner's key argument. It's not only about the cyber, but in general, Krasner argues that the state system is very persistent. And the question is whether you agree with Krasner on this issue, and whether the cyber technology that we have today, like it's more than 20 years after Krasner, the Krasner's paper was published, maybe we need to rethink of this assumption or argument that the state system will be resilient to changes. Whether you agree with this kind of argument, or whether you think that the cyber technologies, and I mean, you can rely or consider not only cyber technologies, but also AI or big data or and other technologies, quantum technologies, maybe if you want, that challenge the idea of sovereignty in a way that the state will not be able to resist the changes. So not now, but in 30, 40, 50 years, the state system will not be able to survive these challenges. Then another argument that should be mentioned here or emphasized, that the state system is a very recent development in human history. Most of the human history didn't have states or sovereign states as the main political entity that characterized the world system, right? We have empires, we have police, cities, we had the
Warlords.
Sorry?
Warlords.
Warlords, exactly. So we didn't have the state system. This is something new from Westphalia. And it's not, I mean, it's maybe the invention of the 17th century, but at that time, it wasn't a global way to characterize or to regulate the world system. So it's something quite new in world politics. And for this reason, the one argument that could be made that there's no need to assume that this kind of system will last forever as well, regardless of the cyber, regardless of the technology. So feel free to move if you need. I cannot control the territory.
immigration.
You don't
and
have
Yeah.
a monopoly over the movement.
I do have some monopoly on the, but not on the use of phones.
Give them your. טוב, איזה סוגים של טכנולוגיה מהישנת? אז מה אפשר לקונטרול כנ"ל לגבי
בעיקרון שאלה א' שיש פה שמאתגר את כל הארבעה. להגיד מה נראה לכם מהארבעה או נוריד את זה, מה יכול להיות מאתגר את כולם, אבל בעיקר מאתגר את
שם ווב של איזה אתר
אז הטייק
איזה אתגרים בעולם
זה השפעה שזה כאן הדברות.
כן, אבל
לא יודע מי משפיע. פעם זה היה, פעם הכוח הזה היה בזה. אני אגיד שאותו דבר היה עושה את זה שזה בתוך היכולות בכוח שמה מה יעשה בזה מצד שני הוא פעם עצמו לא, מצד שני הוא מצד כזה
מאמר שלי עד היום, של דמצ'יק שאומר זאת הטענה שלהם שהמדינה לא יכולה בעצם להיות ריבונית, רוצה להתייחס לזה כמו מאמר שלו מאוד צבאי אבל מאוד מכוני כזה, את התפיסה של מה זה אפשר לשלוט עליו, אפשר לשלוט על חברים אחרים. כי המאמר שאפשר שלדעתי לקרוא להיום, דמצ'יק, שם של השותף שלה. אבל גם יכולות. זה כבר הייתה של המאמר, אבל זה באמת אותה הטענה. ואז באמת זה... יש לזה גם הצלחות, דיברתי על זה קצת שבוע שעבר, למשל, המרחב האינטרנטי, חלקים שנמצאים פיזיים, זה לא שונה בכלל משאלות אחרות של שליטה של המדינה על הטריטוריה שלנו. נגיד המחשבים שבאים פועלים, השרתים, הכבלים, הכל נמצא, חלק גדול נמצא או בטריטוריה של המדינה או במים הטריטוריאליים של המדינה או במים הכלכליים של המדינה. ומה שלא זה כבר נמצא מחוץ לטריטוריה של המדינה, זה לא שולט את זה. בעיה אבל, זה כאילו הצד השני של הדברים, שכדי לאיים על הסייבר, ראיתי שלי, אני בצורך להיות בישראל. לכן היכולת להגן בפועל היא שונה. שאלה כבר מתחום אחר אולי, שאלה שעוסקת בסוגיות יותר פוליטיות, השאלה של השליטה, באמת בצדק, כלומר, זה שנוגע לשאלה, כלומר, אם אומרים שהמדינה לא יכולה לשלוט, צריכות להיות שאלות טקטיות, שאלות אסטרטגיות, אבל לא שאלות פוליטיות, האם הטכנולוגיה יכולה לשמש את המדינה באופן כזה, שמאפשר לה להגן על עצמה בצורה רגילה, מפני אותם שחקנים או מפני אותם... זו שאלה, לא יודע אם למישהו יש תשובה טובה לשאלה הזאת בצורה משכנעת.
אני רוצה רגע למצוא את המאמר, כי הוא גם מדבר כאילו בעבודה שלו, השתמשתי בעבודה בספנה.
Okay, so time. I want to continue. So we'll do. We'll have a break now of 15 minutes. Those of you who want to continue discuss sovereignty, you are welcome to do so. Those of you who want to get coffee or eat something are also welcome to do so. So we'll have 15 minutes break and then we'll start the next part of class by your presentation, a very short presentation of your ideas on common.
הוא מדבר גם בדיוק על הנושא.
גם מגיע, הוא היה איש צבא.
כן. זה ממש כי זה עכשיו נגע לי במשהו שזכרתי. תודה.
אני זהו, אני צריכה
But when it comes to I read in my notes that it comes to the mutual recognition of them being independent entities. So there's eventually say like we recognize their sovereignty. Is that it?
Categories we recognize as sovereignty. The third is that we actually do not intervene. So I mean there's some overlap between the third and the fourth.
That's why.
So yeah, so it's confusing. But I mean you don't need necessarily to block your argument regarding this category. You can say in general what you think about sovereignty or what you think about sovereignty in general, and then take your implication for the cyber, regardless what Krasner's category are.
Okay, so
I mean, so if you feel more comfortable with just saying what is the challenge or what is the type of sovereignty that is challenged, you can make it this argument regardless of Krasner's specific categories.
Okay, that makes sense. Was that the pseudo one? Yes.
we can start, finish first.
Just the name?
Yeah, the names are the least. Okay, so for the question whether what types of sovereignty cyber technologies might challenge. So we had a discussion, we agreed on 3 that for sure we think that they might be challenged. The 4th one, the states that recognize each other, we're not sure about it. But I would like to elaborate a bit more about the control over territory. So with the cyber technology, the territory might be challenged. For example, if there is threats on the borders, on identity theft, and basically the people can just move, they can the borders are not real ones. And in addition for that, actors can attack some state-owned institutions that control the territory itself. So this is the first layer. In regards to the second one is the authority. So there is a few different ways to challenge the authority using cyber technology. For example, we have the example in the elections that was in the United States, that so-called Russian actors manipulated the results and the public mind over Clinton. So this is just one example, but there is many others. For example, spreading fake news and changing the idea of the people, and of course, challenging the rules that was discussed and agreed by the authority. So this is two examples. In regards to the questions, do we agree with Krasner's argument regarding the resilience of the state sovereign system, given the challenges of the cyber technologies? Yes, we agree. We agree with that, but we also added to that with the challenges that the cyber technology might implement on the resilience, if the sovereign state will use and understand that the cyber space is additional dimension to the other fours, the sea and the land and the air and the space, and will use this, will change their strategy in regards to their wait a second, if they will change their strategy and will learn how to use and manipulate this field, they will be able to strengthen their state control. So there is a few other things that can be added, but I think.
So part of the argument is that, I mean, the opposite argument to the cyber technology will challenge state sovereignty is that states will be able to manipulate and better or take advantage of the cyber domain or cyber technology to better control the territories.
Yeah.
Thank you. Who's next? Yes, please.
Got a couple ideas, regarding the interdependent sovereignty. Subsection, I was talking about like control across what the state's own words. We drew on international, like state and non-state actors, cyber attacks, I guess with state agencies, the state sponsored agencies.
Can you speak up?
Yeah, we used the example of like there was a cyber alert that went out last month from Five Eyes intelligence sharing. You see on some of the big countries, Western Europe and Australia, been dealing with that. Of like I guess Chinese state sponsored agencies having persistent access to critical infrastructure. Basically having like external cyber threats being able to affect how the country, I guess, functions in a whole. National security was like a big part of that within like the domestic scope of domestic sovereignty, trying on like social media and being able to sway public opinions or some sort of chaos based on misinformation campaigns, disinformation campaigns, swaying like a government's control over their own borders. And then we have the Westphalian was obviously like the global competition side of it. We're always going to have constant competition between large states, basically like Russia, China, US right now. To draw on like Krasner's argument regarding resilience, we would bring kind of more likely than not, it will stay the same in terms of like states being able to maintain their sovereignty, and it was kind of having to play catch up with like disruptive technology that will always come out faster than legislation, because it's red tape and bureaucracy. So the, I guess, implications that we come up with is that eventually there will be like some increased international cooperation on tech regulations. There's no likelihood of implementation by the court will also define certain camps that we go, because we kind of enter like this multi-fold sphere of global governance. A lot of them probably have to do with economy and how it affects like global finance, that kind of stuff. But
yeah. Thank you. Let's hear what you have.
So we discussed in general how like the whole idea of sovereignty isn't really how it once was, where like you have, especially the international agreements or like things like the EU, where all of a sudden sovereignty isn't really absolute control, because all of a sudden you have all these outside factors or outside treaties or organizations which have a significant impact on what's going on within the borders of countries. And how even now, like with specifically we talked for the most part about the EU, where we have even now discussions regarding regulations around crypto and other different types of cyber technologies. So like it impacts all of the different types of sovereignties that we discuss, with the exception of the last one.
Yeah, so this alludes to the argument that the challenges to state sovereignty is not new, and there are different ways in which they are challenged already. Like the example you provided of the EU is a very good example, because the states, I mean, they are sovereign to decide whether they join the EU or not. But once the state is joining the EU, it's challenge their sovereignty. Actually, I have a course. I taught it this year. I'm usually not teaching this course anymore, but about theories of integration and sovereignty. Or exactly, the title is theories of integration. Why states I don't remember the exact title, but what states give up the sovereignty. And this series explain regional organization like the EU, which requires states to give up the sovereignty. So it's not only about technology, which the sovereignty of state. Yes.
We discussed mainly the all of the territories. This is the main impact of cyber technology on the sovereignty challenge. This creates the main challenge, and together with this, the ability of each of one of us or each one in the world to impact others, and to get technology to get cross the virtual border, which make it as not just a state game anymore. It's like I don't know even how to say it, multi-actors or a very multi-actors game.
Yes.
And such like this. So this will be the main impact on sovereignty and the entire area. And the second one we didn't really.
So I mean, if we take it further, it means that there's no really borders that states can control. For sovereignty is an obsolete concept to capture these kind of.
Yeah, even though I must say that I'm working in an organization, and as far as I know, and this is what also raised my mind when I read the article, that currently almost all the medium to large organizations I believe in the world, but at least what I know from organizations I work for, they do control the borders, the cyber borders, heavily control the cyber borders.
No, the question is whether the concept of border is applicable to the cyber domain.
Yeah, so I'm saying that within the companies do control the borders. If you go into the internet of a company in Israel, you cannot go to a Gamble website. You cannot go to a sex website. Those days it's even blocked on the PC. So I cannot go to Facebook on my PC because it's provided by my company. So there is a border and someone controls the border.
Yeah, but it's not necessarily.
And then it shows that there is a border. And if someone wants to control it, he can do it.
Yeah, of course.
In fact,
but it's not completely overlap with the state borders. I mean,
yes,
of course there is a border, but I mean, border is also can be a kind of ideational border that we can have or not, but it is not exactly the same of the state border, so it's not.
Yeah, but then the question is saying that if a company or a global enterprise can control its cyber borders, which is a global enterprise, and it still can control its cyber borders, why a country cannot do it? And then probably the technical answer will be yes, a country can do it. It's just a matter of decision.
So this is part of the discussion. This is
that's mean that yes, it's the challenges are more from the globalization area rather than from the technology area.
Yeah. So part of the question is part of what technology can be done, of what the states can do and what the non-state actors can do.
And what price?
And what price, right?
About the
price. Yeah. So you wanted to
Yeah,
Yeah,
I
you-
thought that was an interesting point, and I do think we've seen that states can kind of control the borders the way China does. But it maybe then comes into a question of whether open societies can control their virtual cyber borders. Probably not in the long term, and that would give authoritarian countries an edge in that way. You know, you can see how China maybe did or did not influence the Taiwanese election. And
This,
how that
this is more a question of globalization and the openness than a question of technology. For
Yeah.
example, it can be a decision in Israel that any single piece in Israel should come up with a plugin that allow the government to block any website that she wants.
So then she can control the cyber borders.
This is something that can be done. So
Yeah.
that you can control it, but then the decision is control it or not is not a technological decision. It's a
But it's.
political
They
decision.
overlap, you can't really remove one from the other. You know, the technology is there, and ideology wise, will we allow it to happen, is it worth the cost, like what you were saying?
And also comes into the question, how can you reinforce these borders that you create? Like even with the China example, yes, there is a firewall, however, you can use like things to overpass these type of restrictions.
Yeah, for example, you can enforce computer dealers to have this chip on the computers, but the question whether people who are going abroad can buy a counter chip that cancel the
Or
effects of.
hack it, that's what the thing.
Like the
You can just like-
Yeah.
No, it's.
So the question, I mean, and it's also it's also it's always technological question whether, I mean, there is the layer of technology, what can be done or cannot be done with the technology, but also the layer of politics and norms and maybe identities and what is legitimate or not legitimate in a certain country. You also want
There is
to.
a story of the, just to say, to explain what we said in Hebrew, there was a story in Israel in the early 70s where they blocked the colors from the TV. So the Israeli TV shows in black and white, and then everything that comes from abroad, they simply block it and it shows a black and white TV instead of color TV.
But there was
There was an anti-eraser that you need to of course to bring it somewhere. So you need to go abroad to Europe or to the US, bring this was an equipment I believe, I don't even know. To put it on your TV and then you can see in color.
That's.
Yeah.
So
It was
this is
insane that the
exactly
government
It's very.
prevented people from watching color TV. But it's Israel in the 70s.
Instead of just trying to bring color TV.
Because they didn't want people who people to buy color TV. So to because if
Social
it's,
differences, because people didn't have money.
social differences and also the inflation. So they fear that people will start buying new TVs, and it will affect dramatically because everyone would buy a new color TV. So they wanted to disincentivize people from buying new TV. So there's nothing wrong with your old 1960 year model TV. You don't need a new TV because anyhow you cannot watch color TV. Yeah, Israel in the 70s. I mean, there's a lot of. I mean, we didn't have. I mentioned it I think last week. I didn't have a phone at home until I was in the 6th grade or something like that. I mean, this is crazy, but there was a waiting list. So we moved and we waited like 5 years to get a phone line.
It's like an appointment at the doctor right now.
It's still, I mean, it's
Saying, listen,
it's not 5 years.
well,
Yeah.
MRI, yes.
Yeah, it depends which kind of. Okay, you wanted to add something to?
I was also gonna a little bit of a tiny example. It's like a paper what you said, like looking for the Great Firewall as like I guess like domestic and Chinese citizens trying to access the internet outside of China. Like the censorship apparatus of the national security doctrine there is such that like public opinions are really like shared online. By the mass, there's a lot of people there, and everybody has opinions, and they share it on social media. But like the flags, like the automated sensors that will like keyword search or like grab certain things and censor them immediately have to do with starting some sort of like social uprising with sort of 3 different levels of like municipal, provincial, and central. So that is like an example of those type of technologies such as like firewalls, that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Affecting like I guess the country's borders.
So one,
So that,
yeah, so
there's like Hong Kong and the summer 19 uprisings like that, and because like parts that split away, or like new ideas that form.
right. So one of the challenges, if we talk about the categories of Krasner, is the interdependence sovereignty, which is the control of the state of movement of. So movement can be of people, but can also of ideas. So it is very easy. Allegedly, it's very easy to distribute knowledge and information through the cyber domain that would challenge the government, challenge what is allowed to stay in a certain territory. But on the other hand, states may have some technologies or means to prevent this kind of information to be distributed. Who else? Yes.
Most of the things have already been covered in the last. So we did talk about like in domestic sovereignty, we talked about how there's this erosion of borders and things like external disinformation campaigns can like harm the internal domestic legitimacy of like political institutions. We talked about the Great Firewall of China and how it's an example of how states try to be resilient towards like free flow of information, but there are still means to get around it. Like people still use VPN. So like even in North Korea, where they give them hard coding computers that can't access anything but North Korean internet, they still find a way to get onto the darknet. And with Westphalian sovereignty, we talked about how there's like a rise of like non-state actors who aren't not even necessarily like state affiliated. So like things like Anonymous, they have power in this kind of international system despite not being a prominent state actor. And legal sovereignty, we actually talked about the like Brussels effect. Like nowadays, companies can kind of like be dictated the laws that they need to follow in a certain region, and then they decide we'll just follow that internationally. So like GDPR or like a USPC, like they say in all of Europe you need to have this certain rule, and then they just say like, okay, we'll just basically says, okay, we'll just apply that to all the countries because that's easier for us.
Right.
And like Israel didn't ratify the GDPR, so there's no reason that they should have this law, but it just like spills over.
Right.
So legal sovereignty kind of eroded because of cyber technologies in a way.
So on the other hand, it's a way to enforce states' sovereignty, states in plural sovereignty, because all the rules of states globally. So the states still determine they need to cooperate, and it's not maybe the sovereignty they used to have in the past, but maybe, and this is one of the explanations for the establishment of the GDPR mechanism, because a single state has difficulties to challenge the tech giant, but together they have enough power to struggle against this kind of actors, and they can exert their power and show that they are. I mean, they can make the rules, and this is kind of sovereignty. So they make the rule. They need to cooperate. It's not. I mean, there could be differences between the different countries in the EU, but they can agree upon something that they can live with. Absolutely.
No, it's not a bad thing. It's just that does inherently erode your internal like legal sovereignty, because if you didn't agree to it, it's still being imposed like on your country. And customer, we talked about resilience, sometimes to find it, and talked about like technological determinism and how, you know, like there's this kind of like chicken and the egg situation where technology comes first, and then they try to regulate it, and it's hard to like withstand or recover quickly with that.
Yeah, there's also what we heard earlier about the quick changes in technology that the regulation mechanism cannot.
Yeah, I understand.
Yeah, but at the same time, with the emergence of technology, we do not see states collapsing because of the technology.
Yeah,
we have states withstanding the rapid change, and we also have state being able to keep up with it in a slow pace, in their own pace, but being able to keep up and impose regulations that will be relevant for the entire cyber domain. So are the states resilient? Well, yes. And they are not collapsing because of the technology. They're collapsing because of other reasons, but not because of the technology. And the fact that we have regulations that are able to bring to the responsibility tech titans is the sign that states in their capacity right now and are able to keep their sovereign system.
Okay, thank you. We have, yeah.
Yeah, so building on what has been said already, as to not be repetitive, from the 4 domains, from the 4 types of sovereignty, we found that cyber erodes but not fully overrides mostly the domestic sovereignty because it builds on the regulation of behavior. And a large part of day-to-day behavior now is online using the cyber domain. And states can only regulate it or modify it to a certain extent. Of course, large states have a bigger capacity to do that, like Europe, but Paraguay or Botswana don't necessarily have the power to change how Facebook or how Google works in their countries, so they're limited to that. And also on the Westphalian sphere, because tech titans build almost like pseudo sovereignties, like new spheres of sovereignty inside the states. They like Facebook that has offices in the UN or Google that has offices in the UN. They almost build themselves like sovereign entities, challenging the sovereignty of individual states. And also about what Vidam said, I really agree with what she said that repressive states would have an edge because they can regulate, they can limit the access to internet or to technological spheres within the states. And China does it very well. We studied in course in the last semester how they use cyber to control dissatisfaction, to limit mass manifestations against the government. And free countries or liberal countries would have a difficulty in acting in the same way. So you could say that those countries would indeed have an edge. And I also thought about, even before cyber, there was Radio Free Europe or BBC Britain broadcasting to Soviet countries. So technology has been a factor of erosion of sovereignty for quite some time, not just in cyber. But regarding the second question, we do not believe that cyber overrides the concept of sovereignty. It does erode it, it does limit it, but we don't really know yet, and it would take decades for us to know exactly the full impact of cyber in sovereignty. And we've seen some solutions like what the Chinese are doing with the Great Firewall of China, that they believe that the cyber domain is also part of their sovereignty. So there are solutions or there are limitations to how much cyber can actually erode sovereignty.
Yeah, so thank you. So if we refer back to Krasner's paper, one of the mechanisms he suggested, not necessarily about the cyber, but in general, that states have the incentive to cooperate to block these new entities that challenge their sovereignty. So this is exactly the example of how they try to address the challenges of the cyber and the tech giants and so on. But on the other hand, there are different examples of how the new actors are trying to exert their power, how the practices are challenging the state. I'm not sure that I'll get to it today, but a very interesting example is the letter Ze'ev Elkin, was the Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs, the Israeli Deputy Foreign Minister of Foreign Affairs, who wrote a letter to the CEO of Google, complaining that they changed the Palestinian territories into Palestine in the tags. And basically his argument was that Google is not the actor who should determine who is a state or not. So this is the practice, that this is related to the maps of Google, but it's through the practices of these non-state actors, they are taking the power, the practices of states, because who can recognize a state? States, right? This is the basic idea of sovereignty. The states have the ability to recognize each other and the territories. So we'll get back to that. But first, I would like to look at the ways that cyber technology challenge state, not how states are dealing with cyber technologies, how they can take advantage of this this technology. So first, and there are a number of slides regarding this kind of argument. First, states are still powerful, including vis-a-vis non-state actors. They can make the rules. The non-state actors need to pay taxes. Some of the non-state actors try to avoid paying taxes in more or less creative ways. But they also have the power. For example, they can negotiate over the terms they will get from the state or from the city to locate their new branch or new office, like Amazon. Probably you heard about the negotiation of companies like Amazon with cities regarding the conditions they will have if they open a new office and it's like tens of thousands of employees. It's very important for the region or for the state to have these companies, so they give them better conditions, including tax reduction and
In Ireland.
in Ireland, for example. Yeah, there was also in Israel with Intel and the condition they will get. But basically, so states can regulate these actors, but they also have the power to negotiate over the conditions. Second, as Krasner argues, the changes are incremental. Nothing is changing rapidly. It's not that we'll wake up tomorrow and we'll see all the state system, the sovereign state system will collapse. It will not be so fast. It will take a lot of time. And in fact, we see also that cyber technologies can be used by state actors in order to enhance their ability to control territories or enhance sovereignty. For example, using AI and information system like big data to better control the territory. Right? This is what the Chinese, for example, are doing with this kind of tracing individuals and how they are adhering to the rules of the government. In addition, we also see that states try to compete with the cyber technologies in their own game. For example, if they have cryptocurrencies, so states will have cryptocurrencies as well. States also try to immigrate themselves into the cyber domain and to provide alternative services or competitive services as the non-state actors in order to make the non-state actors' alternative less attractive. In addition, Krasner argues that the state system is very resilient. And it's very resilient. Again, it doesn't mean that it will last forever, but it's very resilient because the state system and states have mechanisms that support their ability to survive. Of course, basically there is the advantage of the status quo. People, individuals, and also non-state actors, and of course other actors enjoy the status quo. They don't want to change it. Changing the status quo is very costly, so they want to change the status quo. But states have specifically strong mechanisms that sustain the status quo and sustain their ability or enhance their ability to survive, such as what we talked earlier about social practices like culture, identity, and so on. So rally for the flag is one example. So the change is very costly. People need to invest in new practices, in new culture, in finding new identities. This is not very easy. people need. We'll talk about it when we talk about identities and constructivism and ontological security. People need to have their ontological security. They need to know who they are. And in this sense, changing and giving up the state identity is very, very, very challenging. And in addition, political actors are committed to a sovereign state system that are committed to a sovereign state system have the option of shedding function which they cannot manage. So I mentioned it earlier regarding private prisons, but also there are some examples that some countries adopted the dollar as their currency. I mean, it's not only about cyber technologies that challenge, that create challenges, but also the solution. States can rely on different kind of mechanisms, different kind of practices that enhance their ability to survive. There also came out earlier in a number of in the discussion, but the challenges to the state and the state system is not completely new, as the EU example or other institutions that challenge or may challenge states' sovereignty. They are not fully sovereign entities anyhow. So the question maybe need to be rephrased. Dynamics of globalization and regionalism are not only challenging states' sovereignty, but also are practiced through states. So what is globalization, for example? If we need to translate the dynamics of globalization, is mainly an economic process, right? It's the reducing of taxes, but who signed the treaties of reducing taxes? The states are doing it, so it's regulated and advanced by states actor. And also, if we talk about the regionalism and the formation of the EU, who decided to form the EU? It's a decision of states. So they give up some of their sovereignty, but they also, as a sovereign entity, decided to get into these kind of institutions. And by the way, the EU, I assume you know it, but in the EU, there's no, there are three main bodies of decision: the Parliament, the Commission, and the form of the foreign ministers of each state. And each of these bodies need to agree to any fundamental decision of the EU. So, for example, if they want to join, if another country wants to join the EU, it's need the approval of all these bodies, and therefore each country has the ability to veto any of these kind of decisions. So it's very strong power of each state in the EU to decide, because each of the Minister of Foreign Affairs can veto against any kind of decisions.
Is it correct to say that here what you've just described, any country is selected, is chose to join the union and therefore chose to give up for some of the sovereignty in order to get different things. However, if you look on technology, no one is really in the country level choose to use technology, something that like you have, or maybe, you choose, but eventually you have no option whether to use it, and therefore it's totally different thing. But you lose sovereignty, but without any formal decision or without any different.
Exactly. So you're completely right. It's a very good way to put these things that in kind of this kind of decision, the sovereign states have the right to decide whether to do it or not. While in question of cyber technology, it's not to the state to decide because the technology is there. I mean, they cannot. I mean, there was a period of time, maybe
People decided like themselves and simply go there, and the country have no choice.
Yeah, exactly. So there was a period of time, maybe the government, for example, the American government could decide whether to go on with the development of the DARPA project and all these kinds of projects that culminated into the cyber that we know. But I'm currently presenting the opposite side. There are more slides of how the cyber domain will challenge states, the state and the state system. But the counter argument would be that states traditionally were important agents in globalization and regionalism that by many are seen as evidence of how states do not have full control or how these dynamics challenge state sovereignty. And we do think in various ways how globalization is a challenge to sovereignty. So the counter argument would be, right, this is a challenge, and states do not have necessarily the option to choose or not, because I mean, you can also make this argument that there's a very powerful force in world politics of globalization. The states cannot really stay out of the global process of globalization. They cannot really not join this kind of institution of the WTO or the other mechanism of globalization. They don't control this process. It's outside, and it's to some extent it's technological process as well, because transportation and information technologies are an important part of globalization. So it's also technology, but states to some extent try to fight it by joining it. If you cannot beat them, join them. Argument they want to. They know they cannot fully control the process, or they cannot prevent the process from happening. So they try to determine the process by creating treaties and having a say in the process.
But this is not the case for the last 10 years, at least.
This is not the case
for at least for the last 10 years. States were able to determine something. I mean, I think in the previous century, but not in this one. They're trying to. In the previous century, they were imposing rules, and then business was able to act within the rules. And then now we see private companies doing something, and countries trying to keep up with them and trying to regulate that.
Yeah.
And if you're saying that globalization is a state-made phenomenon, but then technology, innovation and revolution right now, it's not being the state-made phenomenon.
Yes, I try to distinguish between globalization and cyber technologies, but as I mentioned earlier, also globalization has a lot to do with technologies, because transportation and information technologies are a big element of globalization.
But it's not being shaped or managed by state either.
Not the technology, but they try. I mean, they try to regulate as much they could. I mean, if you think of the maybe the period of the 90s, the rounds of the WTO organization, the World Trade Organization, and all the big meetings at that time that try to create the terms of globalization and what kind of economic and trade agreement will be agreed, and so on. So there was a period of time in which states tried to have their input and their voice heard in this meeting and they negotiate. I mean, this was a state negotiated process in which each country wanted to bring their own interest into the final decisions.
It just feels that the article of Krasner, it's not even from 10 years ago. But then, and it's missing the precedent that we had there.
Of course.
Russia-Ukraine war, where companies stepped in. We do not, Crossland didn't have all the developments of the AI. And this very
I completely agree. I'm just presenting the opposite side. We'll get to the other argument. So this is on the other hand that if we want to think why states are not necessarily challenged by cyber technology, we can think of these dynamics from the past. But there are some of the argument that it will be more difficult to make a convincing argument saying that states are still the actors who make the rules.
Right. In a more practical dimension, if we take the example of Russia-Ukraine war and how big tech companies stepped in your opinion, then the sovereignty of Russia was breached, was compromised, and if yes, then according to the structure, to the sovereignty levels we've got. Was it compromised then? That Russia's sovereignty was compromised.
The Russian sovereignty?
Yeah.
Why the Russian sovereignty?
I'm asking.
In terms of what the companies succeeded in
provided its firewalls to Ukraine moved all the data to the cloud. Limit access from Russian IPs to Ukrainian server, to Ukrainian websites, providing stepping in. It certainly protects Ukraine, but what does it do to Russia as an attacker?
It's possible to interpret it in different ways. One is that they serve the interest of the West, of the Western countries, and therefore they were kind of agents of these countries, providing help for Ukraine. On the other hand, you can make an argument that this is a challenge, that these are independent actors who are challenging the Russian, not only the Russian. My argument will go even further. It not only challenged the sovereignty of Russia, but also the sovereignty of the Western countries, because who is providing security, which, as we heard earlier, it's the monopoly the monopoly of countries, is challenged by the provision of security by non-state actors, right? So it's not only the challenge of Russian sovereignty, but also the sovereignty or the story, if you will, the identity of states, that they are the security providers, because this is what states should do. They should provide security to the citizens and to their allies. And if they cannot do it, it's a challenge to the story they tell that they are sovereign entities.
I want to add on that because when the war started, I'm working in a company that is US company, and as part of the embargo the United States put on Russia, they stated that the American companies cannot provide any service or operation in the Russian dimension. So it also affected on the European one. So maybe it's in situation of war.
So again, it's go to the argument that there is some sovereignty of state that they can determine and they can punish economically, can punish actors who are not adhering their rules. Also, this is another example that in the attempt of the revolution, the failed attempt of revolution in Iran, there was kind of the Twitter revolution. It was called an attempt to have a revolution in Iran in 2008, 9, something like that. And the US government asked Twitter to provide assistance to the Iranian activists. So it was, the government can also have some, it has say in some situations. So it's also kind of another way to summarize this. The challenges of sovereignty are not new. Weak states always have problems of sovereignty, like the ability to control the territories, domestically and internationally. There are weak states, they are prone to external intervention. There are weak states, therefore they cannot functioning as a state, they cannot provide or cannot control their territories. Globalization, immigration, international crime, terror, pandemics, environmental challenges, all these challenges are challenges to state sovereignty. There are some global challenges that states usually cannot address by their own. And they are not new. Globalization, I mean, also a question of definition. But it's not necessarily a new phenomenon that in a way that it challenges, not a new phenomena, it's not new in challenging state sovereignty. International norms are challenging state sovereignty because states cannot do whatever they want because there is cost for it. So again, to summarize this point, the technology may help state to better function, to better control the citizens, to better handle the military practices. So you can build on cyber technologies, AI, and so on to better function in battle and have better accurate increased precision and so on. I also mentioned last week that there is the argument that one hacker can make a lot of damage, but an organized army of hackers can make a much more damage. So the point is that the states can use the cyber technology in order to better function, to provide better control of the territory, but to better control its territory in cases of external.
Sorry, I'm just wondering.
External threats.
I'm sorry.
So the state can address these kind of challenges. Also we talked about it, that there are some physical element of cyber technologies. There are cables, servers, computers, they are all located in a physical territory. And the state can easily, a functioning state can easily exert their sovereignty over these elements. And even economic rights are affected by state territories. I mentioned it, but I have a slide on that. That is, so for example, the streaming services are affected by states' borders. So for example, HOT, right? You have the application of HOT, you can download to the application content, but you cannot watch it abroad. Despite the fact that it's on your device, on your laptop, you cannot watch it. But this is not exactly the same with Netflix or with Apple TV. With some of the applications in some of the countries, you can download it, and despite the fact that you cannot watch this content.
So that you cannot watch it abroad, you can watch it abroad, but you need to be connected via the Israeli provider, which means via your SIM.
Of course, if you are connected through this kind of
if you connect it through the Wi-Fi, then you cannot.
Yeah, you can address some of these.
You can see the channel, the sport channel, for example. But if there is a specific game that it's not allowed to be broadcast by this platform.
No, but I'm talking about I'm talking now only about download. let's start with that. With content you download it into your device. So there are different rules of different of streaming providers. Hot, for example, doesn't allow you for different reasons. I guess some of it is property right. That you cannot watch it. You can, I mean, you can watch it if you are not connected to the internet and you are on a plane and the device doesn't know exactly where you are if you're in a plane mode. But once you land and open the Wi-Fi, it traces the fact that you are not in Israel and therefore you not get access into this content. There are differences between Netflix and Apple TV on that, and also depend on the region you are located. So the fact is that international borders also determine the way you can use the content in a streaming application, which is, I think, interesting. And the fact that we have different practices of different companies is also interesting. It also relates to the agreements of the copyrights agreement they have. But I mean, it's not only that, it's also maybe norms and culture. And I mean, you can, especially kind of actors like Netflix or Apple TV, who owns the rights of the content, could have some, I mean, they can determine it if they wish that, accepting all the people who are having their own application and content on the devices to have access regardless where they are to this content. I mean, it can be easily done because I'm not talking about any content on Netflix or any content on Apple TV, but the original content of Apple TV or the original content of Netflix, they could have determined these terms and provided access to it regardless of your physical location. And okay, so we can move now to challenges to sovereignty. One kind of challenges concern external threats. One kind of challenge is that there is a higher degree of uncertainties. We don't exactly know what are the intentions of our opponents. And part of it relates to the fact that cyber is a dual-use technology. So this enhances the uncertainty because usually in terms of security, we have uncertainty. This is the security dilemma. We have uncertainty regarding the intentions of our opponent, whether these are defensive intentions or offensive intentions where they acquire kind of technologies, right? They are arming themselves with tanks, okay? Whether it to protect the territories or they planning a war against another country. With cyber technologies, the uncertainty is higher, is greater because not only we not necessarily know whether it's for defensive or offensive purposes, we don't know if the technology is required for civilian or military purposes. And this enhances the uncertainties. And of course, there are a lot of applications of, for example, AI technologies can be used in various ways and can be adapted to assist military technologies, but also for civilian purposes. There are also challenges in adapting traditional strategies, and there are different strategies that can be discussed in this context, but deterrence is a key example. That whether states can still rely on deterrence when they are addressing their challenges or not. We'll discuss it. We'll dedicate a class for this issue. there are also domestic challenges, or also maybe domestic is not the exact word for the challenges in the cyber domain because the borders are not very clear. But I mean that they can be used by domestic groups or organizations, like the use of Facebook during the revolution in Egypt. People and there are some scholars in international relations who also wrote about this issue, how people were using Facebook as a tool not only to distribute information but also to verify that we are in the game, because you don't want to fight the Egyptian tanks, but if many people in Facebook, I don't have Facebook, so I don't know exactly how you call it there, but if you are attending an event, or how do you call it, right? So you are attending an event, you are attending a demonstration, and you showing your peers that you're going there, people feel much more secure to go to the demonstration against the tanks. It also should be noted that despite the fact that it's mentioned as a revolution that is by cyber technology like Facebook, we should remember that most of the people in Egypt are not connected to the internet. So they didn't use Facebook. Many people who are marching to Tahrir Plaza got maps that people distributed by hand to show them where to go. So they weren't attending the event through navigation applications, but rather using maps and general they should go there or something like that. But of course, this is an example of how cyber technology can ease the ability of subservience organizations that try to challenge the state and its sovereignty. And in addition, they can also distribute, I mean, this kind of actors can distribute information that challenge the state. WikiLeaks, for example, is a good example that challenged the US government because there are some secrets that the government want to some secrets the government doesn't want people to know, but they can be distributed through this platform. And likewise, there is the issue of Google and China that can be seen as a struggle between two superpowers, right? China and Google were fighting about, for example, the ability to provide results in the search engine. And again, we see here the question of sovereignty, whether China can determine the result of Google in China or not, or how people can avoid the censorship of the search engine and find the real answers in different ways. This information operation is another example. Part of the group mentioned this issue, and I say I'm out of time, so I'll stop here. But this is an example of how cyber technologies can provide means to non-state actors to challenge the state. And maybe even more than that, it can provide not only non-state actors, but also foreign governments means to affect the politics and domestic politics of another actor. But on the other hand, as you also mentioned, this is also not a new practice, as the radio broadcast during the Cold War from West Europe to Eastern Europe. So this is not. Okay, I'll stop here. Next week we'll complete this discussion, and we'll start. We'll see how much we'll complete about neorealism. But anyhow, I'm reminding that the class 2 weeks from now will be recorded. So I'll use it to complete all the stuff that will not cover by then. So
It will not be face to face.
it will not be face to face. It appears on the syllabus as well. So April 2nd will not meeting here. It will not be a live class. It will be recorded, and I use this opportunity to
What's the date, sorry?
The second of
second April. It's 2 weeks from now. So we meet next week, but 2 weeks from now we are not meeting in class. You'll just have. I'll upload it probably before the April 2nd, so you can watch it whatever. Yes. So this is the advantage of cyber technologies as well.
Thank you.
Or watch it as a TV series in the.
Yes.
In the evening.
I mean, if you can binge the. הוא לא אצלי, הוא עובר עדיין.
יובל משהו וורקשופ.